viewers. I'm a global nationalist. I support nationalism in my country, India, and in all countries around the globe. Today, I want to talk about the Quad and how they are reacting to the crisis in Ukraine. Let's begin. Let's begin. How the Quad has responded to the crisis in Ukraine, analyzing the collective, bilateral, and individual responses. Now, the Quad is an organization, as you know, about formed by four countries: India, Japan, Russia, India, Japan, Australia, and the U.S. So, when a major global event happens, it's expected that all group, national, international groupings of countries will respond in some way. However, the Quad is a grouping based on the Indo-Pacific. It was created in response to China's belligerence in the Indo-Pacific, targeting the four countries and other countries in the Indo-Pacific, such as the ASEAN countries. Now, so the Quad is not really involved in the Ukraine, but what is happening in the Ukraine is similar to what is happening in, say, the South China Sea, the Indian Himalayas, Japan's Senkaku/Diaoyu Islands. So, therefore, the Quad has given a response. This response has been given collectively in their virtual summit. Also, the individual countries have given their own responses, and bilaterally, the countries have worked together to give a response to the situation in Ukraine, which is the invasion by Russia of Ukraine. So, Ukraine crisis itself. It began in 2013 when the then president of the Ukraine, Viktor Yanukovych, refused to sign the EU-Ukraine Association Agreement, and protests broke out. These protests were called the Euromaidan protests. On 21st February 2014, Yanukovych and the leaders of the parliamentary opposition signed an agreement for early elections. On the 22nd, Yanukovych left the capital city ahead of the impeachment vote that stripped him of his powers as president. The Russian-speaking region Crimea was invaded by Russia and held a referendum to join Russia. A new president for Ukraine was elected in, Petro Poroshenko. This was in May 2014. During the next few years, the Donetsk and Luhansk regions of Ukraine, which had a majority Russian speakers, also announced independence. In 2022, on the 21st of February, Russia officially recognized the breakaway regions as republics and sent troops to the territory. On 24th February, Russia invaded the rest of Ukraine. Now, the collective response of the Quad came in the virtual summit of the Quad leaders that was held in March. The joint readout from the mission, which is basically a summary of what was spoken. It was not same it's not really the official stand taken during the meeting. It is simply, it's kind of more informal. So here, the joint readout from the meeting said they agreed to stand up for a new humanitarian assistance and disaster relief mechanism, which will enable the Quad to meet future humanitarian challenges in the Indo-Pacific and provide a channel for communication as they each address and respond to the crisis in Ukraine. So no other mention of Ukraine was there in the joint readout. It was not mentioned at all in the joint statement. Now, what does this mean? Well, this joint readout means that first, this means that they are going to each individually respond to the crisis in Ukraine. There's not going to be a collective response to it, and that they will be working for providing humanitarian assistance and providing a channel for communication for Ukraine. This shows that this is something I agree with, and also the fact that they did not mention Ukraine anywhere else in the joint readout, and it is not mentioned at all in the joint statement, is evidence that it is not a major focus as of now for the Quad. The Quad is focused on the Indo-Pacific, as mentioned here, and the crisis in Ukraine is simply something that they're noticing. They're not going to be very involved in it, which I agree with. The United States of America's response to Ukraine's invasion. Now I'm going to the individual countries' responses. Since 2014, the United States has committed more than $7.3 billion in assistance to Ukraine, including security and non-security assistance. On March 15th, President Biden signed this was after the invasion began. President Biden signed the bipartisan Ukraine Supplemental Appropriations Act to provide an additional $13.6 billion in military, humanitarian, and economic assistance to help Ukraine defend itself from Russia's unprovoked further invasion, ensure the government of Ukraine can function effectively during the conflict, and support the people of Ukraine as they endure attacks from Russia's forces. So, yeah, the US is providing both different types of assistance: military, humanitarian, economic assistance. This is complete support to Ukraine, and they're helping Ukraine in their war with Russia. So on March 24, Biden said the United States will provide more than $1 billion in new funding towards humanitarian assistance to Ukraine. So twice assistance has been given with humanitarian aid being a focus. This shows that this is probably the most important issue that Ukraine is facing. Lots of people are being unfortunately killed in this war, wounded, and their houses are being destroyed, their livelihoods are lost. So they need humanitarian assistance as a first priority. Hopefully, this aid came to the people who needed it and helped them. The US took several actions against Russia. So not only is the US helping Ukraine, it is also going against Russia. On March 8, the US banned the import of energy products from Russia. It sanctioned individuals in Russia's government and their relatives by cutting them off from the US financial system and freezes any assets they held in the United States. Now, I have a mixed feelings towards, let's say. I agree that these are the people who launched this war and therefore they should be held accountable. But and so I can understand cutting them off from the U.S. financial system so that they don't, so that the U.S. doesn't indirectly support this war, which is against one of its friends, and freezes that. However, it's freezing the assets is something I don't approve of because I think those assets should simply be left alone. That they should be made sure that once they're cut off from the financial system, I don't think that these people can they get access to these assets. So I don't think the government should take over them. I'm not sure how legal that is. And the US Treasury prohibited Russia from making debt payments with funds subject to US jurisdiction. American citizens have been prohibited from investing in Russia. Also, there were sanctions leveled against state-owned firms, which prohibited American citizens from transacting with these entities and freezing their assets subject to US jurisdiction. So, again, both these I agree with, except for the freezing of assets within US jurisdiction. Australia has provided 65 million Australian dollars in humanitarian funding to help meet the urgent need of the Ukrainian people, including shelter, food, medical care, and water. Australia has been sanctioning Russia since its annexation of Crimea. When Russia recognized the Donetsk and Luhansk republics, Australia sanctioned them as well. Australians who have business activities in these regions will have to end them. So when Russia, yeah, this I don't. I agree with the giving humanitarian aid. I hope it reaches people so that they can stay safe, they can survive this crisis. But I don't think that they should sanction these regions because that is kind of getting involved in the internal politics of Ukraine about whether these regions should be free or not. I think they should just let them be. From April 25th onwards, Australia will prohibit the import of oil, refined petroleum products, natural gas, coal, and other energy products from Russia. If Australia is sure that they can get another energy source in time to fulfill the gap left by this prohibition, then I'm okay with this. I just hope that they don't suffer too much, that their prices in oil and diesel and petrol don't grow too high. It also prohibited export of aluminum ores, alumina, and related products to Russia from 28 March onwards. This is, I guess, to hurt Russia's industrial and manufacturing base because aluminum ores are needed for manufacturing. Japan. On the 27th of February, the Japanese government gave humanitarian aid in the form of food, medical care, child protection in Ukraine. So I agree with that totally. On the 11th of March, Japan extended 100 million US dollars of humanitarian aid to Ukraine. Uh, so this is great. They're focused. They've twice given humanitarian aid to Ukraine. I'm happy for that. Japan announced, like, made a similar decision to Australia on the 24th of Feb that it would suspend visas for individuals from the Donetsk People's Republic and the Luhansk People's Republic, freeze the assets held by those individuals in Japan, and certain Russian banks from issuing or offering securities in Japan, and restrict them. This is okay. Uh, I again, like I said, think that this is somehow uh, by suspending visas from for individuals from these regions or republics or however you want to call them. Japan is taking a position that these are not sovereign republics, and that issue is an internal issue for Ukraine to decide, and they haven't. So I don't think that standing going against it is a good thing for Japan because later, if these republics are recognized internationally, then Japan will have to apologize for suspending visas and it would set off their relations on a bad beginning. Then Japan froze the assets held by those individuals in Japan. Again, don't know if this is legal, freezing people's assets and restricting certain Russian banks from issuing or offering securities in Japan. I can agree with this. I think this is completely within the government's power to do so. On the 3rd of March, Japan announced that it would freeze assets held by four additional Russian banks in Japan. Japan also froze the assets of 18 Russian nationals and seven Belarusian government officials. So this shows that Japan is targeting both Russians and uh, Belarusians who are involved in this. They're not letting Belarus off the hook. I couldn't find any major sanctions leveled by the U.S. and Australia against Belarus. Perhaps there were, but I couldn't find them. But due to lack of time, but even so, the fact that with the lack of time, I could find sanctions against the Belarusian government by Japan shows that Japan seems to be putting more emphasis on targeting Belarus than the other countries, but I might be wrong. In April, Japan expelled eight Russian diplomats and announced a ban on coal, oil, and on import of coal, and restrictions on imports, including timber, vodka, and machinery. This I can understand, but like with Australia, as long as Japan can find an alternative source for these goods, then it's completely within their right to do so. India. India is the odd one out. India abstained in a resolution at the United Nations Security Council, which called upon Moscow to immediately stop its attack on Ukraine and withdraw all its troops. The resolution was vetoed by Russia. So, yeah, this resolution was brought to the UNSC by the United States, and it was completely blaming Moscow for this war in Ukraine, and India felt it was should have that not want to blame Russia because one, it has friendly ties with Russia, and two, it doesn't think it's suitable to hold only one of the parties into account in this war. So it abstained. It was neither for, did not believe that Russia was innocent, but also did not want it going against Russia. So that's why it was abstained. The UNGA passed resolution condemning Russia's actions and calling for it to withdraw its troops, and India abstained in this resolution. India again abstained in another resolution to UNGA to expel Russia. Now, Russia had warned countries that an abstention in such a resolution would make it more likely for it to be expelled, but still India abstained. This, therefore, in abstention somewhat hurt Russia, but still it is an abstention. Still, India's neutral position. India is not taking a stand between Ukraine and Russia. At the United Nations, India has repeatedly called for peace and diplomacy during the conflict. India also called for safe passage of all civilians and citizens of all countries from Ukraine. This was with reference to Indian citizens being stuck in Ukraine, and India at that time was trying to get them out and was successful in getting all of them out. Prime Minister Modi has spoken to President Zelensky and President Putin and called for a return to negotiations and an immediate cessation of hostilities. On the 1st of March, India sent humanitarian aid to Ukraine through Poland. This comprised medicines, medical equipment, and other relief material. On 9th March, a second tranche of humanitarian aid was sent to Ukraine through Romania. So yeah, India basically took a neutral position, but did give humanitarian assistance like the other Quad countries. Therefore, as I said before, the earlier mentioning of humanitarian assistance and aid for Ukraine, as said in the joint readout of the Quad Virtual Summit, had an effect on how each of the individual countries uh, reacted to the Ukraine crisis by all of them giving humanitarian aid. That was one point on which they all agreed. And the second point was that uh, peace should be restored. But the difference was that India did not level sanctions against Russia, but the other three did. That was the major difference. That's caused a bit of unease amongst the other Quad countries, which I'll talk about in the bilateral responses. India Japan bilateral response. India and Japan have had different responses to Ukraine in order to have a joint approach to Ukraine crisis. They agreed that they will not tolerate any unilateral and forceful change in status quo of Ukraine or any country in the world. They will continue to push for a peaceful settlement of the conflict. Japan and India will also jointly address the situation whenever needed, and finally, they will work together in giving humanitarian aid and assistance to Ukraine. So, this is something India said in its own response, along with giving humanitarian aid. This is interesting because this is referencing to how Russia is trying to get the eastern parts of Ukraine to become sovereign countries. This is a true force, and India and Japan have said that they will not tolerate this. So, if those two countries are properly removed from Ukrainian control, India and Japan won't recognize them unless they gain international legality and legitimacy. And Japan and India will jointly address the situation whenever needed and find. So this India and Australia had a virtual summit meeting in March between the Prime Ministers Modi and Morrison, in which the crisis in Ukraine was discussed. In the joint statement, it was mentioned that they expressed their concerns about the conflict and humanitarian crisis and seek to change. So that's pretty good, I think. There's no need to for either of the Quad countries to try to change the other's positions. They're all sovereign countries and should respect them. And still, there's a common ground agreement between India and Australia that humanitarian aid should be given to Ukraine. Now, the India-US bilateral response came during the 2+2 dialogue between the Ministers of External Affairs and Defense and the US's Secretaries of State and Defense. The joint statement of the meeting mentioned Ukraine. It said that they reviewed their mutual efforts to respond to the worsening humanitarian crisis in Ukraine. They urged for an immediate cessation of hostilities. They condemned civilian deaths. Yeah, so that's the issue with in India and the rest of the Quad countries. India has not sanctioned Russia, but the others have. But this has not broken apart the Quad. The Quad is still united and strong, which is very good sign for the future. It shows that in the future as well, if there are situations where the Quad countries don't agree with each other 100%, they will not turn on each other and dissipate and become divided. So yeah, I I'm happy with how things are working and would like to end this with wishing good luck to the Quad. So that was a video. I hope you liked it. If you want to see other videos related to the Quad, click on this playlist. If you want to see my previous video, click on this video, like right here. If you want to see the sources I use for this video, click the links in the description below. Thank you for watching. Vande Mataram.